From Nashville, Tennessee, this is Mysterious Matters for those who dare to think. And ladies and gentlemen, today's guest is Professor Mark Mirabello. Professor Mirabello has a book out titled A Traveler's Guide to the Afterlife: Traditions and Beliefs on Death, Dying, and What Lies Beyond. And if ever there was a mysterious matter anywhere in the world, it would certainly be what lies beyond this veil of physicality. And if after listening to this program you are interested in reading more about A Traveler's Guide to the Afterlife, you can go to mysteriousmatters.com/afterlifeguide. That is mysteriousmatters.com/afterlifeguide. And without further ado, Professor Mirabello, welcome to Mysterious Matters.
Well, thank you, sir. It's an honor to be on your show.
It's an honor to have you here. Now, for the remainder of the show, may I call you Mark?
Yes, that's fine.
That is great, because I may mess up your last name a couple times, and I don't want to do that.
I'll probably call you sir repeatedly because I lived in Britain for several years, and that I sort of picked up that habit.
That's what we do here, too, in the South. I mean, no matter your age, it's just a matter of showing respect. Whether you're sir or ma'am, you have people that's younger than you looking at you funny when you do that. I guess the very first question has got to be, how did a professor of history from Shawnee State University find himself getting involved with researching the afterlife?
I'm an old-fashioned generalist. I probably should have been born in the 19th century. And I've been reading on this subject really when I went to graduate school in Scotland. And it's a really mystical country. The sun is never high in the sky, and it casts so many shadows. And they have Scotland and England have a high percentage of per capita ghost hauntings and so forth. And I've just been intrigued by the other side. And I approach it not in a kind of denominational way or particular cultural way, but there are 3,500 known societies. Obviously, I couldn't do them all, but I went through and studied comprehensively and found interesting and unusual things about the afterlife. What happens at death, the trek of souls to get where we're going, how do we achieve a higher afterlife rather than a lower one, debunking myths and so forth. And it just became an obsession. And these books just sort of grow. Once you start, they grow, and then we give birth. So I'm rather proud of it. I had fun writing it, and most of all, it was a learning experience. We always learn when we teach, and we learn even more when we write.
Yes, we certainly do. But for us to peer into what the afterlife is, do we not first have to understand what our own existence truly is? Because some people have theorized we might be holographic images. Well, what's your take on that?
Yes, in fact, that's possible. I actually have a section where I basically start out saying we really have no idea where we are now. And again, I just go through a whole series of ideas. There's the concept, not only what you just mentioned, but also that this is all the dream of a god, or it's perhaps our own dream. There's this idea this is all just thought. And there's the idea, for example, found among the ancient Greeks, Euripides, the playwright, refers to it, that we, in fact, are already dead. In fact, one of the curious things is, I think as time goes by, 17th, 18th centuries when science really split off from traditional thought, religious thought, philosophical thought, and became basically matter, energy, that's all there is. But I think over time, if science continues to develop, they will intersect again. Sir James Jeans, who was a noted cosmologist, astronomer in Britain in the earlier part of the 20th century, he delivered a series of famous lectures in the 1930s at Cambridge. And near the end of his life, he commented that more and more the universe seems more like a thought than a machine. And I think that may be the case. And by the way, it's interesting to me, maybe how I got into the subject. I'm in a small university, and as a result, I'm in an interdisciplinary department, so with other disciplines and fields. And highly educated people, often in the Western world at least, just dismiss religion, philosophy, afterlife concepts almost as childish stories, equivalent of Easter Bunny and Santa Claus. And I've always been appalled by anyone who rejects any area of knowledge. So, for example, an extreme, a really fundamentalist Christian, or let's say a fundamentalist Muslim who would say that maybe the Bible or the Quran, that's all that's important. I'm not going to read Darwin or anything else. This flip side would be a scientist who says, no, I just reject this. There's no afterlife. We're just going to become ozone and fertilizer in the long term. The mind is simply a product of an organ called the brain. We're made up of essentially 99% or so of us, or maybe 6 elements. And I think it's far more complex than that. And I think it's really important to think about these issues. There's a great line from the Buddha who said that someone who doesn't think about the next life, if you will, is like a man who's fallen off a cliff who simply decides to enjoy the way down. And essentially people who use their 70, 80, 90 years just to eat, drink, and be merry and accumulate wealth, I think that's perhaps a wasted life. And we have to really consider the big questions. And I think afterlife is the ultimate one. We're all going to be going there. Although, as I mentioned at the end of the book, there are legends of a few immortals that are still on earth. Mormons talk about, for example, that the Apostle John is still here, waiting for the end times, because that's a reference in the Gospel of John. Jesus says basically that when it's talking to Peter, and they're talking about the one that Jesus loved, and he tells Peter, this man will tarry till I come again. They also have the 3 Nephites that are still allegedly here, immortals, and then we have traditions in China of immortals. But assuming we're not immortal, I think it's important to determine how we get there and have the best possible existence. It's like studying for your SAT exams before you take them.
Going back to what you just discussed about the Bible, I had always wondered if they would have been here, continually here in their bodies, or perhaps they were the only ones out of that era from the time of Jesus that he was going to allow to continually being reborn. And in that sense, they are immortal here on the earth.
Could be. In fact, there's all these legends of unknown superiors that help guide the human race that are here. We find them in, legends among the Rosicrucians, for example, and you find it in the Jewish Kabbalah about these sort of just men who are always here, sort of guiding the human race. But it's interesting. Hopefully, this is what I was trying to achieve at a much more modest level, kind of a guide to the other side.
You mentioned that we might already be dead on this end, but how would we know if we were dead? Would we tell somebody, pinch me, see if I wake up, or pinch me, see if I come alive, or whatever? How would we know?
We really couldn't know. In fact, that's one of the characteristics, I think, of the modern West, is we always assume that we have to have the answers to everything. And there are some things that are impossible to prove. For example, it's possible now, when we established, you and I just a moment ago, contact on the telephone at 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on a Friday, that the entire universe came into existence at that moment. And in fact, your listeners who are listening to the program, that they really didn't pre-exist. All their thoughts and memories. Keep in mind, the only evidence of the past would be our belief, or our memories of it, and our only evidence of the future would be our belief in it. And in fact, there was a 19th century book by Gauss called Omphalos, and he was actually a very devout Christian who was trying to challenge the sort of Darwinian thought in geology at the time. And he wrote this massive work arguing that the universe not only could only be 6,000 years old, as the Bible seems to imply, but it all came into existence a moment ago. That all the thoughts, memories, fossils, signs of erosion, we point at the Grand Canyon and say it took all this time for this river to cause that Grand Canyon, but that a God could have created it a moment ago and could have made it a going concern. In fact, the title is based on the idea, he said, that anyone coming along a moment after God made Adam would see a navel on the man and also see a man roughly 30 years old and would assume through that this is a 30-year-old man when in fact he's only minutes old. So, by the way, in ancient Greek thought, we still use the word skeptic. It's from Hellenistic philosophical school, but the original meaning is someone who says that all knowledge is uncertain. Not only, for example, religious knowledge, but also all the scientific knowledge is completely uncertain. And that's why, if I could actually go into another comment, I hope I'm not rambling here, but I close the book with this on a paraphrase. Blaise Pascal, who's the father of modern probability theory, he was a 17th century French mathematician. and also philosopher, and obviously mathematician. He has the famous Pascal's wager. Of course, I paraphrase it. He puts it in Christian terms, religious terms. But I close with the notion that, let's say, there's two positions. Either the afterlife doesn't exist, and if you take that position and you're right, this is a gambling thing, if you will, and you're right, you win absolutely nothing, if we put it in gambling terms. But if you're wrong, you stand to lose quite a bit. So according to Pascal, the gambler is always going to play the second option. That's the wise choice, and that's what we should all do. So, and again, we tend to think, because the way it's packaged, that scientific thought is superior to, again, metaphysics or religious thought. And here I'm plagiarizing. This actually circulates. It was a fundamentalist minister who said this, that what modern science, he's partly being sardonic and he's being funny, but it's true that modern science essentially teaches that if you take a hydrogen and over a long time, it turns into human beings. Now, that sounds ridiculous, but that's essentially what science teaches, that we have the Big Bang Theory, and then over time there's some cooling, and stars form, and the elements form, and you get hydrogen, helium, lithium, and so forth, and over time planets form from that, and over time you get basically inorganic cells producing organic cells, which then evolve through natural selection into lower forms of life, then higher forms of life, and then human beings. So hydrogen, over a long time on its own, turns into humans. And that's essentially what science is teaching. Now, I'm not trying to say we shouldn't study it, but again, give religious thought a break, is what I'm really trying to say. We should study that as well.
Could hydrogen, could the atoms, could the photons, the neutrons, could all that just be something of a dream particle? As in somebody, like we mentioned before, somebody could be dreaming us, and all these particles are just dream particles that we are noticing because we are the manifestation of dreams.
Yes, there's actually an Eastern sage who talks about that the other world is as real, and he's not trying to say it's not real, but the other world is as real as the pleasure we feel in sexual dreams. Keep in mind, when you're in your own dream, it's an entire world. Mm-hmm. And the pain seems real until you wake up. The pleasure seems real until you wake up. So this all could be an enormous dream of some sort. There's also an interesting Hindu idea that, in fact, this is the game of a goddess. It's a kind of a playful young goddess, and it's just all a large game, and it amuses her. And she brings it all into being with a kind of a dance. And that's why it continues, because she continues to be amused by the game. Which, oddly enough, that idea is found, strange enough, because I've studied all areas, in Scientology, that essentially we got trapped into this matter, energy, time universe because we were all-powerful beings, and we were basically bored, and we started playing a game and got trapped in the game. It's one of the sort of principles of these higher notions of Scientology. And again, the idea that we really don't know where we are has been quite intriguing to me. And by the way, even the way it reminds me in thought of, even if you take traditional religious thought, there's this notion in Judaism that God is over 7 billion miles high. Now, since Pluto is just over 4 billion, I guess it's 4.6 billion miles out there, this would be a rather large God. And we could essentially just be perhaps in a jar on God's shelf and not even realize it. You know, the notion that our telescopes and our satellites giving us real information, again, reminds me there's this Eastern concept in Hinduism that where they say that a human is like a frog at the bottom of a well. And he thinks that the slimy walls and the patch of sky, the circle of sky he sees above him, that's all there is. And he thinks that's what is real. And essentially, we may be trapped in some kind of, maybe even an abyss of some sort. And we're reaching out, but we're confusing what we're picking up as all of reality. And there may be much more out there. And by the way, in the 19th century, there were these notions that perhaps the God figures and also the dead are in a fourth dimension in space. They're right next to us. They only came up, ancient Greeks said there were only three dimensions, but then in the 19th century, a German mathematician began to speculate there could be another dimension in space perpendicular to this one that we could not access but may exist. And so that's a possibility as well.
I was actually thinking as you were speaking that it's also possible that we could be nothing but the blood cells flowing through God's body or God's being. And when we look into space, we see this universe, we see multiple galaxies and everything else beyond us, that what we're looking at is just everything that's residing within the body of this God, this entity. What are your thoughts?
Yes. Well, it reminds me, in a sense, remember the old 1960s sci-fi novel and also film, Michael Crichton, Fantastic Voyage?
Yes.
Where they go inside the human body to perform some surgery. The notion that, in fact, this universe that we know, in fact, the galaxy that we're in, is just a molecule in something larger is found in Eastern thought, in Hinduism, speculations. And then there's this modern French movement called the Raelian movement. Again, I've studied all sorts of things here. They argue that there's been some sort of ET contact and so forth. It's quite a complex idea here, but they essentially have resurrected the idea that this galaxy that we have is simply a molecule in a larger organism, and there are actually galaxies inside of us. It goes in both directions. And incidentally, there was a sci-fi short story in the early 20th century, and it's rather intriguing. It opens with this giant falling into Lake Erie, and the author is this alleged person in Cleveland, of all places, and he sees this giant fall into Lake Erie. Now, as the story unfolds, the giant starts getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and then ultimately they learn his story, and he was literally working in a scientific laboratory in a much larger universe, and they were developing a technique to miniaturize things, and apparently the machine malfunctioned, and not only was he miniaturized, he can't stop it. And he explains to them he's already fallen through several levels of reality, that he appears as a giant and then disappears. And at the very end of the story, he's getting smaller and smaller, and he's standing on this table, and eventually he disappears from sight. And he's continuing to fall farther down. So, again, that seems outlandish, but possible. It's not the Raelians also, when they say that we're, for example, molecules in us are galaxies as well, right away various skeptics will say, well, that's not possible because of time and so forth. But they actually say that time is different at each level as well to solve the problem of how this all works. But it's quite intriguing. It
is. It certainly is. To think that I may have galaxies within my body, and within those galaxies could be worlds, and within those worlds could be people, and they're looking for their God. Does that mean I would be their God, that I created those galaxies, and that you created the galaxies and the people that lives within you?
The notion of God, one of the things I actually discuss in the, not a specific chapter, but the Western world, again, it seems to be, we always come up with simplified extremes. So you have people believing that either God is this all-powerful being, and there's only one, and that everything that's in the universe is being controlled by him, to basically people saying, no, it's all just natural law and this doesn't exist. In fact, the God idea of an all-powerful deity is quite late in history. Ancient gods are not that way. In fact, it's pretty clear, even if in the original books, the older books of the Old Testament, when it talks about God walking around in the Garden of Eden, they mean that literally. And when they say that God was created that man was created in the image of God, they mean this literally as well. Incidentally, the Mormons have brought that idea back. They literally think God's about 6 feet tall, and he looks like a man. And in fact, one of the principles in Mormonism is you go through certain rituals, and if you do it correctly, and you go through various procedures, an individual can become a god in his own, with his own world, if you will, of worshipers. It's again, they normally don't talk about it in public because, again, Americans are really simplistic on their theology and are outraged by this notion. Now, in Jainism, which is a religion in India, an ancient religion in India, they have 4 levels of existence, essentially gods, humans, and then animals, plants, and mineral things, and also below that, hellish beings. Strangely enough, it's symbolized by the swastika of all things. Of course, they were using the swastika long before the Nazis were. But they say there are more gods in the universe than there are humans. And strangely enough, the goal of Jainism is not to go to God, it's to go beyond God. Most Eastern religions argue that, and again, this is rather puzzling to Westerners, that, for example, there's always the god Shiva. He's the person that's Shiva. He's a Hindu deity. Is there for millions and millions of years, but ultimately, the soul that I shouldn't even use that term, but the entity that is Shiva is replaced. For example, after you've exhausted your karma, if you do something really wonderful, you can be reborn as a god. After you've exhausted that karma, you'll fall to a lower level, typically. And they say that usually after serving as a god, most people do fall, or most entities do fall, because they're corrupted by the power and the bliss. So they'll fall. And then someone else is born and becomes Shiva. So there's always a Shiva, but it's not always the same Shiva. And in Jainism, the idea is to, which is also from India, is to actually become a trans god, to go beyond gods. They say since gods literally will eventually die, everything dies and is reborn, and then you go become a kind of trans god, you rise to the top of the universe, they say it literally at the top, and you're with absolute knowledge, bliss, and power, and you simply live there forever. And by the way, according to Jainism, and indeed also you can find this idea in Buddhism and Hinduism, not only you and I, we were both gods at one time, but also everyone listening to your program. In fact, Westerners tend to view reincarnation, people trying to discover like what my past life was sort of thing. But in the East, they view it as billions and billions and billions and billions and trillions of lives. And that's why the goal is to escape this endless cycle. They basically teach various techniques to escape the endless cycle. But over these trillions of lives, and by the way, the Buddha refers to, at one point he's talking to his disciples, and he points to a mountain in the Himalayas, several miles high. And he says, see that mountain? If you would gather the skeletons from all your previous lives and pile them up here, they would be taller than this mountain. And over those vast number of lives, everybody has been everything. So all of your listeners have been gods, they've been sort of demonic figures, they've been pirates, they've been presidents, they've been kings, they've been killers, they've been saints, you name it, they've done it. In fact, in Jainism, we're not actually humans, we're just simply temporarily humans. Because in the Jain universe, it never begins and never ends. And what essentially happens is desire causes us to fall. We accumulate karma, and it actually increases our ignorance and clothes us in bodies. But we've always been here, and we'll always be here unless we manage to escape and become, again, beyond the gods, become this kind of trans-god figure. Mm-hmm. And very few actually are able to do this. And they think that time is this endless cycle. Notice that modern science in the West always talks about how the universe begins. Well, in fact, that's just a question they get from Judaic-Christian theology, because almost all traditional cultures, including Eastern cultures as well, think there really never has been a beginning. When Hindus talk about the beginning of the universe, they mean this particular one. But it never completely disappears. And of course, by the way, you also have that concept of this is all, again, the dream of a god, and he sleeps. Actually, when he wakes up, it all comes to being in a daydream, and then when he sleeps, the entire universe disappears for about equal length of time that it existed. And it's a vast length of time. So we could be, again, lost, and we don't know where we are or where we're going. And it's important to learn as much as possible about possible future destinations.
Yes. When we speak about reincarnation, as you were mentioning it in the different beliefs, it almost sounds as though we are inside of an arcade game, this is where my mind went. I don't know if you played arcade games when you were growing up. I did. And anytime you'd end up dead or whatever, you'd have to insert more coins, and then that character got reincarnated, and you could continue the game or whatever. That's what reincarnation sounds like to me. Is that the way that some beliefs are, that you can maybe insert a coin to continue?
Strangely enough, it depends on where we're looking. In Eastern cultures, the whole idea is to stop the game. And then in other cultures, for example, we find, and by the way, reincarnation ideas are found globally. It's not just Eastern cultures. And the Winnebago Indians in the United States, I think we're over by Green Bay, and I again mean the original Winnebago. We've managed to corrupt a lot of these cultures and ruin them. But they viewed reincarnation coming back as virtually a kind of a special favor, and they would join secret lodges and get secret passwords to be able to come back and live another life. So there it was viewed as a special boon or bonus. And they were literally talking about just a few lives typically, which tends to be in many cultures. There's also some African cultures that believe you maybe come back perhaps 7 times. Whereas in contrast, in the East, it tends to be this goes on and on and on, and I have to escape. Now, when you talked about the coin, it reminds me, in some respects, what Buddhism teaches is our last thought creates the new life, brings us back. That's why you'll find in Buddhist thought, as well as in Hindu thought as well, it's really important, the dying thoughts of the person. In fact, that's what the Tibetan Book, The Dead, which is from a diamond vehicle Buddhism in Tibet, it's read to the dying person to try to guide him to a better future. And one of the things that shocks the East is a considerable number of people in the West literally die drugged up because we're so obsessed with pain in our culture that we feel that easing the exit of the person is the most important thing. But they say that's the wrong thing to do because when the drugged up person goes over the other side, you're dramatically increasing the chances that he comes back as an animal at some level. Now, again, fortunately in the East, the game isn't over and he can eventually turn back into something better in the future, but it's sort of a temporary disadvantage, which reminds me, I mentioned that diamond vehicle Buddhism. What that's all about is trade shortcuts to escape these karmic traps and to achieve freedom faster, which is really the main goal. It's a form of what's called tantric thought. There's right-hand tantric and left-hand tantric. Typically in the West, all the books are on left-hand tantric. That's where you use sins, meat eating, by that I mean beef in the case of Hindu tantrics, drugs, alcohol, and sexual orgies, in an attempt to achieve instant freedom from rebirth. They describe it as a really dangerous path. Most will fail, but under the guide of a guru, you can achieve instant enlightenment by essentially living, I don't want to pick on Bill Clinton, but Bill Clinton's life. So maybe he's a tantric. Oh, by the way, do you know the Clintons actually had a voodoo ceremony when they were on their honeymoon?
They did.
Yeah, it's really curious. The voodoo, by the way, voodoo is a legitimate religion.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to criticize, but it's kind of curious, is in voodoo thought, they have the red sect and the white sect. And if you basically want to heal your cold or get something, a new job, you consult a white sect voodoo practitioner, and it's for small stuff. But if you need something really important, or for example, your huge business is collapsing, or you want to become rich and famous, you must go to the red sect, which is far more dangerous, and you call upon really old, dangerous Loa, they're called, the gods. And usually a harsh deal is struck. By that I mean these Loa will always demand payment, and it's usually something high. But I always found it curious, and you can find a New York Times article on this, because recently the man who conducted the ceremony in Haiti passed away, and I was astonished that the New York Times mentioned it in their obituary of this man. And it was while the Clintons were on honeymoon. They went to Haiti, and they consulted this voodoo priest. So that could explain, at least in the eyes of people in Haiti, how they got where they are, so to speak. Again, I'm kind of off the subject there, but
it's very interesting. I had no clue that they did that.
I'm sure. Now, again, by the way, it's a legitimate religion, but if this were to come out in public eye, it's again how Americans have this really narrow mind of what's acceptable. It reminds me, back in the 1940s, there was one of Roosevelt's vice presidents, Wallace, was deciding to run for the presidency after the death and so forth of Roosevelt. And they published, he was interested in occult matters, and he was writing letters to Nicholas Roerich, who was a Russian artist and occultist. And somehow the press got a hold of these, and they ridiculed them. They published the guru letters, they called it, and it destroyed his political career. And I don't understand why our culture, the more and more we talk about tolerance and embracing other things, intellectually we're getting narrower and narrower and narrower. And that's one of the things I again try to address in the work. By the way, when I was talking about the notion of God, another idea we have in the West is that if you do survive, you survive forever. But we don't know that. In some, there's the idea that the soul may linger after the death, like smoke lingers after the fire is extinguished. And also, we have Easterners. Now, this is all due respect that famous book by Dr. Moody, Life After Life, which made a lot of modern research possible, where he was collecting he has a PhD in psychology and also an MD, and he was collecting near-death experiences by people that had been clinically dead who would come back and survive. And, of course, that was published in the 70s and really tended to open up the eyes of many of this. But it's interesting that Westerners think if they see paradise or something, bright lights and wonderful things, they're in heaven. But in Eastern thought, in fact, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, we all experience that, and then we begin to fall. In fact, we first see the pure light of the void, and if we draw back from it, we continue for up to 49 days in what's called the Bardo state, and then we start to fall. Now, when we first start to fall, we also start to see these beautiful beings, and they're wonderful, but then if we stay in there and can't escape, we fall farther. And then we see horrible things, including what appear to be demons who are tearing off our heads and ripping out our intestines. Now, the Tibetan Book of the Dead says none of this is real, in the sense of really real. It's all a dream, based on the content of our own minds. And they say that what's really important is to remain calm and focused. Do not be attracted to the beautiful beings in the beginning. Do not become obsessed with them. Do not be afraid of the demonic beings. And if you can remain calm and so forth, it gives you information, and I give the details in the book, which direction to go to have a better rebirth or to escape totally. Another idea I should mention that Westerners tend to get wrong when we talked about reincarnation. People in the West, because again we're thinking in Christian terms, they think that you or I, we have our life, and then when we die, it's kind of here our virtues are weighed, and here our vices or sins are weighed, and then we subtract one from the other. It determines where you go. Well, in fact, in Eastern thought, each completed action leads to another life. So if you do something wonderful, one individual action, it leads to a really positive rebirth. And if you do something really bad, one action, it leads to a negative rebirth. So as you're living this life, you're actually creating thousands of future lives by your various activities and my various activities. So it's not this last judgment notion. It's far more complex than that. Again, it's interesting how wonderful some of these notions and interesting they are. By the way, one cultural group that I found really intriguing, because to me they probably represent perhaps the dawn of the human race and what human beings thought. The Aboriginal people of Australia, when the British essentially found them in the 18th century, by found I mean they were lost, obviously, but when the British went there, they have their religion is incredibly rich, but also so different from ours. For example, the Aboriginal people in Central Australia, which had no contact really with anything else, they really don't have a God. There's no God in the religion. And it's curious, we can't find a culture originally that has no idea that the afterlife doesn't exist. They all believe in the afterlife. Every culture believes in ghosts. But we can find cultures without gods. And this would be one example. But everybody comes back. In fact, when you die, they thought the soul was the size of a grain of sand, and it stayed on Earth. There was no other world to go to. And it gravitated towards sites sacred to their ancestors, each little clan. And then it waited there until the proper woman came along, and it chose to be reborn. So we're always on Earth, and we've been here always, and we'll be here always. And incidentally, the afterlife has absolutely no connection with ethics whatsoever in the Aboriginal people, which is intriguing because we don't see the connection between ethics and your future destination until the great civilizations emerge. And it appears as if the idea of ethics was introduced as a means of social control. Get the poor people to stay in line.
Mm-hmm.
If they see the rich fat cats now, they'll say, well, we'll tell them these guys will be punished later. And when they're starving in their hovels, we tell them, well, you'll be happier in the future. The earliest culture where we see the notion of ethics being in the afterlife would be ancient Egypt. But interesting enough, they include in their magical texts, such as the Book of the Dead, I think it seems spell 125, how to short-circuit that with magic. For example, if you're over on the other side, use this magical spell, and if you've been wicked, you can still not be destroyed. Again, we just a given. If we have a soul, it's forever. If we survive, it's tied to a god, and if our status in the next world is tied into ethics. None of these are given when you study afterlife concepts globally.
I don't know if you've ever heard this show before, but I was born and raised a Southern Baptist, therefore I'm a Christian. But as I've gotten older, I've branched out. I've become aware that I'm not going to say the Christian belief is brainwashing people, but it's very strict. And a lot of Christians aren't willing to look at other layers of possibilities. I've actually been led to believe, not through Christianity, but other means, that we are allowed to roam for several days after our physical death, up until our actual funeral, and then we're called to the afterlife. Are there different perspectives on what happens to us upon leaving our flesh and blood form?
Yes, and by the way, I have listened to some of your programs, and they're well done. I enjoyed them. To be fair on this, the Southern Baptist perspective, and I don't mean to disparage Christian thought. In fact, I talk about a few Christian groups in the work as well. And in fact, in global terms, it would be what's called, what the Southern Baptists would believe would be called Bhakti Yoga. And what that means is it's a quick form of salvation based on devotion to a loving being. And of course, in Western fundamentalists, now remember the medieval church was saying you've got to obey the church and you've got to follow our rules, sort of thing. And then you got salvation by faith with Luther, and then you get in the notion of, especially in the 19th century on, of these spontaneous conversions that even if I'm a sinner, I'll be saved through the love of Christ. I accept Jesus as my personal Savior. That's actually a legitimate path. And I talk about it in one of the entries. And indeed, it also sounds like, by the way, Pure Land Buddhism, in which literally if you say once in your life, Namu Amida Butsu, that's in Japanese, after your death, no matter how wicked you are, you go to a Pure Land paradise. And of course, Christians have the notion of through saved through the love of Christ. Now, if you're interested in like post-death experience wandering, and they're universal around the world, the travel. In fact, there's a famous one I think it's Joseph Campbell describes it, where this Eskimo shaman describes how he dies, and then he goes, he travels along the campfires of the ancestors. That's a reference to the stars of the Milky Way. And then eventually he sees this village, but he doesn't eat. Whenever you eat in the next world, you can't come back. That's a universal concept. And then eventually he does come back, and he emerges from his grave. They would bury him just under a few rocks and ice and so on, so he could just sit up. Now, in Christian notions, by far probably the most developed would be the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, who was an 18th century scientist, who roughly in his mid-50s began to experience really dramatic visions of not only God and angels, but the other side. And he writes these many volumes. He never started a religious movement, but his readers started it after his death. It's known as the Church of the New Jerusalem. I'm in Ohio. Urbana University by Columbus is actually associated with that church. Helen Keller, the famous woman who was blind, deaf, and dumb, was a member. William James, the psychologist, and Henry James, the novelist, their father was a minister in this particular church. But Swedenborg gives really elaborate descriptions of, and incidentally, he said he didn't have, visions where he would be a quick view. He literally, it opened up and he could just see it as if he's looking out of a picture window. Now, again, people could reject this, but what's fascinating is how detailed it is. And he says, now, if you're especially pious, you could skip this step, but most people, when they die, and again, he's talking in strict Christian terms, go to the world of spirits, and they're there at most for 30 years. That's where you see loved ones, friends. And Swedenborg said the most stunning thing in the world of spirits, it exactly resembles this one, and most people there don't realize they're dead. And it has sky, it has what looks to be a sun in the sky, and has grass on the ground, and people live in houses. And then over time, based on your ruling love, he called it, you gravitate towards a heaven or a hell. Now, what made his hell interesting is it's not really, well, let me put it this way. If you take a frog or an alligator or a salamander is even a better example, and you put it in a beautiful pasture with flowers and green grass, they'd be miserable. They like the swamp. They like the slime. They like the stench. Well, according to Swedenborg, God, and he's talking to Christian God, doesn't really send us to a hell. The wicked are drawn to it. In fact, it reminds me of an old Twilight Zone episode where the man, he thinks he's in heaven. He's a robber of some sort, and he's gunned down by the police. And then he thinks he's in heaven, but he gets really bored. And at the end of the episode, he tells this person he thinks is an angel, I don't really find this place enjoyable. Could I go to the other place? And the guy who's the angel actually is a devil and says, this is the other place. And so they freely choose to go there. And incidentally, he describes what look like dark, slum-like cities where people rob one another and rape one another and commit atrocities. And that's the evil people that gravitate towards hell. Mm-hmm. And then the good people are drawn by the ruling love, this love for others and affection for human beings. They go to these beautiful places where other beautiful people are. What's interesting, too, he says that in the next life, your face, because your face is determined here it's determined by biology, what your parents look like. But he says in the next side, other side, your ruling love determines it. So, for example, sweet elderly church ladies who die at 94 are on the other side these beautiful young women with stunning faces. And beautiful people here who die at a young age because they're gunned down in a bank robbery, over there they become really repulsive in appearance. That's why he says that hell is dark, because God's mercy, he doesn't want them to see how they really look. And he says whenever briefly the light of heaven enters hell, that's why it causes them pain, because they see how they really are and where they're really living. But still, they choose it by choice. And again, there's people in the United States that in life, instead of living in with wonderful people and beautiful people around good people, they like to go to bordellos and drug dens and join gangs and kill people. And they're doing what their ruling love is. It also solves the problem, we forget, would an eternity, even a good person, an eternity, would he become corrupted over time? I remember I said earlier the Jains and the Hindus say that eventually the gods are corrupted, and that's why they're reborn. If you have endless bliss and happiness, wouldn't you not become corrupted? Now, Swedenborg deals with this by saying that the other side is actually timeless. There is no passage of time. And you remain forever, essentially, what you are when you get there. or when you eventually reach your final destination. Oh, and it reminds me, too, he has this really humorous, he's not trying to be funny, but he has this, he sees in a hellish area a group of freethinkers, and they're actually giving lectures on how the afterlife doesn't exist and God doesn't exist. But they're actually dead in the other world, and they have no idea that they're there, that they are there, sorry. So his works are quite intriguing. Now, and by the way, some other, I already mentioned how the Mormons have some unusual ideas. The United Society of Believers and the Second Appearance of Christ, everybody knows them as the Shakers, they have some interesting ideas. And what's especially interesting is they emerged in the 18th century with Mother Ann Lee was her name. She was an English woman that came over the United States. And they believe that the first time Christ appeared, he appeared in the form of a man, Jesus. He reappeared in the 18th century, this time as a woman. That was Mother Ann Lee. Now, they don't worship her because they said basically there's one God, and Jesus wasn't that God. Neither was Mother Ann. They simply were his representative here to teach. And they taught, they're almost extinct, but they still exist, a really high level of morality, perfectionism it's called. In fact, modern Christian churches, I don't know how they got this idea, they tend to say, the minister will say, we're all sinners, and I'm a sinner, and you're a sinner, but we'll still be saved. Well, Jesus says in Matthew, you must be perfect even as your heavenly Father is perfect. And Shakers took that seriously. And among the teachings, they actually were total sexual abstinence, hence the reason they died out. But she taught them that the original sin is sex in the Garden of Eden. And by the way, we tend to miss that, although Jewish rabbis see it because they read it in Hebrew. The word to know, or the verb to know in Hebrew, also means to have sex in Hebrew. And clearly, the prohibited fruit is sexuality. And in fact, in the Kabbalah, rabbis teach that not only did Eve, she actually had sex with the serpent, and then had sex with Adam, hence causing the original sins of of the couple. And Mother Ann Lee again restored those ideas. That's what the primal sin. Even within the context of marriage, sex is wrong, according to Mother Ann Lee.
Wow, yeah. That's really interesting. Right now, for some reason, I'm envisioning Eve making out with a serpent.
Actually, the passage in the Kabbalah says the serpent injected filth into her. It's really graphic.
Wow.
Now, keep in mind, I should also mention that, here's again, sometimes the rabbis seem more sophisticated than the Christian people are when they read these texts. I don't know why that is. Probably because they have fewer and they spend so much they've had, and it's, a couple thousand years ahead of us, advantage, if you will. But you'll get among the Hasidic Jews, they're the ones that you see in New York with the beards and the black hats and so forth. And they're also prominent in Israel. They start in 18th century Poland. They're ultra-Orthodox, and they believe that the Torah, that's the first 5 books of the Bible, no Jew would actually say all the Old Testament's of equal value. They have the books of prophecy, the books of history, and then the Torah, that's the law directly from God, first 5 books. They say it's word for word from God, but they would say we don't know what it means. And it's true, because 20% of ancient Hebrew is of uncertain definition. And I think we should learn from that. And, for example, any fundamentalist, both in the Quran, or let's say the Vedas of India, or of, again, Christians, you say, well, this is the word of God, perhaps, or the gods, but we're not altogether certain what it means. And I think it's a valid point. So, again, the sophistication is quite intriguing to me.
In your book, A Traveler's Guide to the Afterlife, Traditions and Beliefs on Death, Dying, and What Lies Beyond, you discussed how some people believe a deceased person, that they shouldn't be buried in a metal casket, but instead they should be buried in a wooden casket. And neither should they be, embalmed or cremated. Could you explain the beliefs behind that? Or the reasons?
Actually, that was from Crookall. He was a early 20th century, late 19th century British scientist, of all things. He became really interested in spiritualism and afterlife concepts. it's quite intriguing how late 19th, early 20th century especially, but mainly late 19th century scientists conducted really sophisticated research in this, and now nobody even looks at it anymore, and they act like they were wasting their time. But Krukal came to be convinced that there were two types of death, and he has his reasons in his work. He argues these points at length. A violent death is the soul emerges in a different way, and it's like a cesarean section in birth. And then a peaceful natural death is like a natural birth. But then he says that when the soul is leaving the body, he talked about two levels of soul. That's a very common idea, that you have not only your mind soul, but there's also like an astral corpse, if you will, involved. A lot of traditions say that that's what you're actually seeing as a ghost. It's not really the dead person, it's his astral corpse he's left behind. The dead person's elsewhere. That's why the ghost tends to do the same thing over and over again, and seems rather unintelligent, is because you're just looking at a fraction of it. Well, according to Krukal, when we embalm people or bury them in metal coffins and encase them in concrete, or frankly cremate them, it actually, in the case of embalming, it makes it more difficult for the mind soul, if you will, to escape. And when we cremated them, it also causes problems of a different sort. So he suggested basically burying a dead person without embalming in a coffin of wood, which, oddly enough, that's what Orthodox Jews actually do. Now, they don't say it because of his reasons, but they're prohibited from embalming the dead. They also will punch holes, typically, in the coffin if they use it. Sometimes they just wrap them in a burial shroud. And they'll put even earth on the dead person, on the belly, which is where decomposition starts. Now, the reason they do that is, again, in Talmud and Kabbalah traditions, they have what's called the judgment of the grave. They think that the dead person feels decomposition, punishment for his sins. So again, like a lot of traditions, we kind of cheat to help out the loved one. They try to speed it up by punching the holes in the coffin and putting earth in the coffin. And it's especially useful if you use earth from the Holy Land. So there's actually a business where people can order it, I guess now through the internet probably, and if you need to bury a loved one. And it's really curious how often corpse disposal is important in determining afterlife. In many cultures, in ancient Mesopotamia, they gave us Sumerian civilization, Assyrian, Babylonian. The unburied become miserable ghosts walking on the earth, tormenting the living and feeding out of garbage bins, essentially. So when the Babylonians buried someone, it was literally to protect the living, not so much to help the dead, although it did help them, but they were protecting themselves. And then when you see cremation, like you'll see it in Hindu cultures, it's typically to get a quick release from the body and to spring the person into the heavenly segment. By the way, burial cultures the person goes to an underworld often, and then in cremation he goes to the sky. The ancient Greeks thought, again, if you didn't bury a person, he would become a wandering, miserable ghost. It does seem, though, that the safest way does seem to be burial without embalming in wood, sort of cover the bases, which, of course, the funeral directors won't want to hear that because it cuts down the cost. Now, in cremation, in some respects, it's important because it releases the soul. But if we were in ancient Egypt, cremation would kill the soul. They would be horrified by it. In fact, I talk about the Egyptians in the work, and they're so mysterious, which is really curious because their writings are very straightforward. It's just that the culture just seems so unusual to us. It's very difficult to interpret. And in fact, I actually include what I think an Egyptologist would call heretical information. It was actually first proposed by a 19th century Egyptologist, and they've rejected it since, but I think it makes sense. The whole reason to embalm the dead, Herodotus, the Greek historian, described that Egyptians believed in reincarnation. And for 3,000 years, you'd come back as various animals and so forth. Now, modern Egyptologists ignore that. They say Herodotus was wrong. But it would explain what they're doing with the mummification process, because in sympathetic magic, like causes life. We're familiar with the voodoo doll. You make an image of someone, you hurt the image, you hurt the original. It works the other way. You preserve the image, you preserve the original. It appears as if they were embalming the dead to keep that person, that persona, alive. And they also put in the tomb statues and pictures, because the statue is his image. It's like a voodoo doll, and so in a lesser level it would be the picture. By the way, a sculptor in ancient Egyptian language literally means he who keeps alive. So I would not recommend cremation, because the Egyptians seem pretty rather versed in afterlife knowledge. Not that they're always correct, but they would be utterly appalled. And by the way, they would be appalled by plastic surgery that we do over the United States and the Western world today.
Really?
They went to great lengths to preserve the face. They would put linen and mud inside the mouth and the nose, because they thought that was the person. That's an important part of his personality. And when you change the face, you're going to change the person. In fact, we do all sorts of things that would horrify them.
Mm-hmm.
Heart transplants would horrify them. Plastic surgery. Now, that I'm not trying to say we shouldn't do these things, but they would be just astonished by it, and that what we're doing to living people and also to dead people.
There are some individuals, stars in particular, who undergo the knife, have plastic surgery, and when they come out, they don't look like themselves. They actually look like a plastic doll, if you will. I mean, that they really just totally screw up their looks.
I remember, I forget who it was. He was some South American intellectual that was visiting Southern California in the 1990s, and he said he was amazed because he saw all of these living mummies.
Mm-hmm.
He said mummies without wrinkles, he called them.
Yes. If you think back to the very last several years of Michael Jackson's life, he practically had no nose because he had had so much plastic surgery that they almost removed it just about, it looked like.
Yes, and the curious, probably illustrating we're still in a racist culture, the curious skin lightening techniques he went through as well.
Of course, I heard that might not have been something he did, but rather a rare illness.
Oh, I think that was a cover story. There's a tendency for people to do the unusual. Again, I could be wrong. I'm not a Michael Jackson expert. But it always struck me as a cover story. Because, again, he was criticized, especially in the black community, changed appearance. And by the way, oddly enough, the use of cosmetic surgery to change a person's appearance only begins in the 1920s. That's how recent it is. And it was some theater actress who did it. She had a nose job, essentially, because she felt her nose was too large. And ever since then, it's gotten more and more common. In fact, I was even in high school with a couple girls. I lived in the suburbs who got plastic surgery in high school.
Wow, that's too early.
Yeah, I'm pretty old, so who knows where it is now. But it is curious.
Yeah.
It would appall the Egyptians, though.
Yes. Going back onto the topic, I remember, and this is in the mythology and different stories throughout the world, that there's individuals called fate, and we have strings attached to us. And in your book, you discuss something about a silver thread or something along those lines, and I know it's also in the Christian Bible. It might even be a beam that's invisible to our naked eyes. What is this, and what's its purpose?
Well, the notion of that silver thread that's found in, I think it's Ecclesiastes, if I remember correctly, and it's the notion that it's kind of like an umbilical cord. And some of the people that travel believe in what is known in the modern world as astral projection, astral travel. They believe that as long as that cord is intact, they can leave the body and journey elsewhere and then come back. And once the cord is broken, that's essentially death. The soul goes elsewhere. So this connection is essentially to keep us on this earth, if you will.
Okay.
And again, they tend to reason. You notice in a lot of religious thought, in fact, that's what I found really interesting. They'll reason by analogy. For example, a common idea that's really universal, well, that if you want to know what the afterlife is like, you were there last night. In many cultures, what sleep is temporary death. And when you awaken, it's the only difference is you come back when you awaken. But when you die, it's basically it's permanent dream state, if you will. And that's a really widespread notion, reasoning by analogy between, well, in fact, even in Greek mythology, sleep and death are brothers, if you will. I should say siblings. But and by the way, there's another curious thing about us. In fact, research on dreaming is really interesting, and we don't. Sometimes, again, regrettably, the psychologists tend to be materialists, so they don't really read significance into certain things. But the way we're designed, for example, we can find cultures in Central America, Aboriginal cultures, that believe that the dream world is more real than this one. And what's curious about is when we dream at night, we forget most of our experiences there. Yet we remember our day-to-day experiences. Now, imagine if it were reversed, and it would be possible that you lived your daily life and then you went to sleep and you forgot everything you did with just a few fragments the previous day, but then you remembered everything you did in sleep, in dreams. That would alter our perception entirely, that what's real and what's not. And there must be a reason that we forget dreams. And I'm not certain what it is, but it seems to be a design. In fact, it's really curious how often certain things seem to be designed into us. It reminds me, even the fact that we die. If you look at biological organisms, well, if your listeners want to see a immortal that will not grow old or die, get a microscope and look at bacteria. They're immortals. They don't age, they don't die. They can be killed, so your various antiseptics can kill them. But and also what's interesting that when they don't give birth, they simply practice fission, and they produce an exact duplicate. So if I did this, there'd be an exact duplicate of me, indistinguishable from me, and then it would go off on its own. Roughly where sex occurs in the food chain is where death does. Once we start reproducing sexually, and of course there are lower forms as well that do this, most of them do, death happens. And that again ties back to the Bible. They have sex and they die. And we seem to have a limit to, for example, cells can only replicate so many times. It's called the Hayflick limit. Why is that? And oddly enough, cells that can replicate endlessly and are essentially immortal are cancer cells, which is curious. Kind of ironic, when I was writing this book on death, I actually, during the course of it, was diagnosed with cancer. Kind of gave me extra incentive to maybe finish it. But it's curious. Why are cancer cells immortal and can replicate endlessly, and then normal cells are not? And it does seem at times. That's why when people suggest that we didn't really just evolve here, but we're planted here or somehow made, it does seem that seems to be, there's certain traits about us that are highly unusual.
I believe this doesn't go along with my religious beliefs at all, obviously, once you hear this, but I believe that we are all holographic images. We are in a holographic classroom, and we are each learning the lessons that we need to progress to a different level in our next life or whatever. And that's actually what I believe from everything I've learned over the years.
That's very possible. In fact, what the holographic, what they've discovered about that is that's the famous notion that you can take, the whole is embedded in the part. So if you take part of the hologram, you can reproduce the whole thing. And some have suggested, perhaps you even had this gentleman on your show, that again, the whole universe is just a big hologram, and that we're in it. Again, anything is possible. I don't really have the answers, but I can clearly give people information to try to find them.
Yeah, we don't have the answers to that. I mean, it's just one of those mysterious matters in our lives. And speaking of mysterious matters, Halloween is right around the corner. This is October. This is the month that many traditions believe represents a thinning of the veil. What can you tell us about the thinning of the veil and why Halloween is the perfect time for such occurrence, as far as the different traditions all over the world? What do they believe?
Well, in fact, by the way, every year, and I've been doing it for years, I give this annual lecture at Shawnee State University, and of course the university provides free food and so forth for the students, and we turn out the lights, and I give them all this ancient lore on ghosts and ghouls and vampires, werewolves, and so forth. But originally, Halloween is actually, it's the Celtic New Year. And the reason we have it in the United States and in Europe is the Celts, who incidentally were encountered by the ancient Greeks and the Romans. And they actually, now almost certainly everyone that's listening to your program has Celtic blood somewhere because they spread all the way across Europe, including, again, Black Americans would have Celtic blood because of what went on in the New World. And they were these ferocious fighters, and the Druids were their priests, well-known descriptions by the Romans, very mysterious Druids. But they had two seasons, especially summer and winter, and the year ends and begins. Their New Year's Eve is October 31st. And normally in traditional cultures, when a threshold occurs, where you cross into another period or do something different or go into a different reality, that unleashes all kinds of supernatural forces, and it's especially sensitive. So the Celts believed that the deceased could come over here, and also various godlike beings can go both ways. By the way, the Celts were such an interesting people. They actually have one of their heroes, and again, their depiction of the gods and the dead are very different from traditional Christianity. A group of Celtic human heroes decide to use the Halloween threshold to cross over to the world where the gods are and to rob them, steal gold and silver from them. I always love that story because it again shows a different depiction of afterlife and so forth. And by the way, the Celts actually they're unusual because the afterlife and the gods are actually down, not up. Most people put them in the sky, but the Celts had this notion that these beautiful underworld places that typically entered through pools of water or wells or hillsides. An opening would open up in a hillside, and through a fairy circle, they would call them. Scholars for years argued the fairy circle is just where the grass had died in a certain way. Almost certainly it's crop circles, they were saying. We just didn't realize it until recent times. And it's a beautiful, wonderful world. And it's, but what's interesting, they viewed it as a birthright. You didn't have to do anything to get over there. It was, everyone went there. And they were so convinced that it was real, and also they believed in reincarnation, by the way. You eventually come back. They actually would lend money or treasures to someone saying, you pay me back in your next life. That's real belief. I've tried that in a bank, but they won't let me do it. But the Celtic, although one thing about the Celts, if your listeners, read, you have to be really careful. It's amazing how much absolute rubbish has been written about their religious beliefs and history and so forth. You have to be really careful. There's some really good stuff out there. But they're an intriguing people. And all of our Halloween legends are really derived from that. And it's now the Christian church, because they viewed this as, when they fought paganism, they always tried to close all this stuff down. And they failed. They couldn't really close Halloween down, so they invented what the Catholic Church called All Souls Day and moved it to November 1st, where people go to church to remember the dead. In fact, oddly enough, when we go into Christmas celebrations, that's actually the church's attempt to, they failed to close down the birth of the sun. There was an annual pagan holiday for the birth of the new sun at the winter solstice, and they fought to get rid of it, but they couldn't get rid of it, so they moved it a few days, and then they made it Jesus' birthday. We know he wasn't born on December 25th because the Gospels indicate the shepherds are out with their flocks when he was born, and they wouldn't do that in the dead of winter, so it's almost certainly spring when he's born. But that was their attempt to basically, if you can't beat them, you alter it and spin it. And of course, in recent years, with the reemergence of neo-pagan movements such as Wiccans and so forth, they're restoring this Halloween into its pagan roots, which it really does have. Which reminds me, because you said you're in the South, I'm in Portsmouth, Ohio, right on the Ohio River, which was settled basically from people from the South. Southern Ohio was. And you can see the dramatic difference between around Columbus. But at any rate, the local churches here are very powerful, and they don't ever let the children go out on Halloween night. They always act like it's another day. And I think it's because they realize the pagan significance. They normally give an excuse like, well, we don't want them to intersect with the Friday's football game, or we don't want them out on a Sunday. But they clearly recognize the pagan significance and have altered it accordingly.
Or maybe they're afraid the children will be taken to the other side.
Could be. By the way, the fairy folk, which are from Celtic lore, it's unclear exactly. Now, they're in medieval Christian times. Some have suggested they're the old gods altered by the Christian Irish. But they were known for abducting children and also nursing mothers. And then when they abducted, they would leave behind in the place typically an old fairy or a piece of wood. And they would disguise it with magic, which was called glamour. Technically, when a woman today says she's glamorous, I don't think she realizes what she's saying. It means I've used magic to disguise the fact that I'm really an old hag, but I'm looking good to you. Because that's what it literally means, strange enough. And by the way, the word, they thought that they had these arrows that could strike people and who, for example, spied on them. And this was called elf stroke. And that's how they explained strokes. Because a person looked normal, but they often couldn't move anymore. They were paralyzed, couldn't speak. They thought they had been hit by elf stroke. And in some cases, if they couldn't speak and move and so forth, they also thought they had been that a stock had been left behind. You're not actually looking at great-grandma anymore. It's actually a stock disguise.
That actually reminds me of a show I've been watching on, I think it's Stars. It's called Outlander. And there was this one instance where a mother had left a child in a tree. They believed this child was a changeling, a fairy child, and that because this child was a fairy child, it could not thrive in the human world. So the belief was to put this child up into a tree so that the fairies who stole the original child would return the original human child and take the sickly fairy child with them. Have you heard of any traditions or beliefs that follow along the same line as that?
Yes, but Norm, I think it's definitely a belief. There's no doubt about it. But often the screenwriters in modern Hollywood alter the stories because in the original tradition, they would have been horrified by that. You know, the child abducted, and a fairy child left in its place, because they would have thought, where is my real child? It reminds me, there was, as late as the 19th century, or 1890s I think it was, there was an Irishman who was hanged because he claimed that his wife had been replaced, and he beat her to death. He kept telling her, hey, where's my wife? And tell me, he thought she had been abducted by the fairy folk, and they left someone behind in her place, which I think, I'm trying to remember the name, I think it's called Capgras syndrome. Today, our culture is so skeptical. Every year, people around the world will go into the authorities, I use that in quotation marks, and say that my daughter, my son, my father, my mother, my wife, my husband, grandma, grandpa, they've been replaced. That's not the person. And help me. And they say it looks like them, but it's not them. And today, if you do that, of course, this sounds familiar if you've ever seen the classic film, and it's based on a novel, The Invasions of the Body Snatchers. That's what happens. And but today, we're so skeptical, we think that the person reporting the alleged abduction is mentally ill. And who knows? In the 1960s, there was this bestseller, and it influenced various New Age movements and so forth, especially Heaven's Gate, that religion where they all committed suicide in San Diego. And the author, a woman, was talking about walk-ins, where essentially people were being replaced, that an alien was entering the body of someone who was here and taking over. Which we find, by the way, it's not just sci-fi and aliens. We find this notion in earlier cultures. In fact, there's a wonderful story I mentioned in the work. It's Sir John Woodruff during the British Empire days. And they used to produce these really curious characters that were amateur scholars and were adventurers and so forth, not simple capitalists ripping off the locals. And Woodruff was somehow involved in the legal system in Calcutta, I think it was, and he's walking along. This changed his life. He saw a funeral starting where they had a young man, and because the man was of wealthy family, they wrapped him in silk, and then they cover him in clarified butter, and then they set him on fire with fragrant wood such as sandalwood. And he's watching the initial stages. And as he's watching this body being laid out, this elderly man who could scarcely walk walks up to the body, utters some words, and collapses dead. And then the dead body on the funeral pyre sits up, takes off the bandages, and walks away. And he was astonished. Now, again, skeptics will say this couldn't possibly happen, but this actually is a technique described in the East. In fact, Tibetan Buddhism calls it fo wa, where you can actually put your consciousness in someone else. Now, if this sounds like an H.P. Lovecraft story, because he uses it in one of his stories, but they describe the technique. And Woodruff, he was stunned by it, and he asked these sort of Hindu sages, well, if this is real, why don't you do it more often? And the reply was, well, why do we want to use body? We'll be reborn as babies and get a new one in a very matter-of-fact way. Mm-hmm. Well, he spent the rest of his life, he wrote all these books. He was afraid it would ruin his career, so he used the pen name Arthur Avalon. And he writes all these books on mainly tantric practices in India. But intriguing. I mean, the idea that you could take over. Now, again, it reminded me of bunching about the baby, where I went with that. But, oh, by the way, in earlier times, it's actually horrifying. When women gave birth in, let's say, 11th century, 12th century after Christ, if they had an especially deformed child, sometimes they'd be murdered by mobs because it was a widespread notion that they had sex with either the devil or an animal. And they'd kill the baby. Now, again, this wasn't technically authorized by the church, but the locals would become kind of like a lynch mob. Mm-hmm. And but the church would probably teach at that time, typically, that suspected she had been engaged in some kind of unusual practice, sexually speaking. They also had the idea, this still lingers in pregnancy times, like, for example, modern husbands think they have to run off at 3 o'clock in the morning to buy ice cream because the wife has a craving for it. That goes back to earlier times where they thought, it's called the power of the imagination, that the mother's mind influences the baby. And they had to protect her from any kind of obsession because they thought, or fear or fright, because they thought it would impact the fetus. They would, in medical textbooks up into the early 20th century, they were describing that this woman who came around the corner in Italy in one of the towns, and just she went around the corner, she was pregnant, a butcher cut a pig, he was slaughtering a pig, and he cleaved the head. And they said when she saw that, it created a hair lip on the child. Now today, we just judge that as ridiculous, but it was taken very seriously. But the idea of making certain the mother doesn't get obsessed by something dates from that time. And oddly enough, it's slowly coming back in modern medicine. They rejected it completely in the mid-20th century and said that no matter what the mother thinks about, it's not going to influence the child. But now it's slowly coming back.
Yes.
And I think it's probably significant in some way.
Like I've mentioned before, your book is A Traveler's Guide to the Afterlife. Mark, have you ever in your life experienced a spiritual being of any sort or any other type of paranormal experience?
Well, this is a curious question at two levels because, and again, I'm not recommending this to the reader because it's totally different. But my first work is actually on one of these neo-pagan religions called Odinism or Asa True, and I refer to it's called the Odin Brotherhood. And strangely enough, I don't know how it really occurred, but when I was a graduate student, and it was actually my doctoral dissertation at the University of Glasgow, was on various Scottish dissenters in the Restoration period in the 1660s. So it's purely in a Christian context. And I tended to make these trips to Edinburgh to do research because I was in Glasgow. They're only 45 miles apart. One thing led to another, and then eventually meetings in London with this alleged secret society that perpetuates this pagan Norse belief. Well, the reason I brought that up is because all these people were telling me that a couple of them, that they had seen these gods. And then some years later, now again, I'm not trying to say this is true or false, but I received letters from postmarked Frankfurt, Germany, purportedly from this pagan god Odin. And then a woman from Germany came here to tell me about this. Now again, not saying this is what it really was, but it was intriguing to me. Now at a more traditional level, sadly, both my parents have already passed away. And in both cases, now at the time I didn't recognize it, I felt that when they died, I had contact. Now, in the case of my mother, I was still in graduate school in Glasgow, and my father called, and I was actually on a train. He said, she's not going to make it. You have to come home. And this is the day before internet. That's how old I am. So we had to do it right now. We can't do the screen thing. So I was on this train going to London, and I was in a sleeper car, and it was probably 3 o'clock in the morning, and I felt like she was in the car with me. And we really didn't communicate. I just felt she was there and okay, at peace. Years later, my dad died in 2007. He outlived her by many years. My mother died of cancer. My father outlived her by many, many years. And I was asleep in Portsmouth, Ohio, and I just woke up abruptly and felt that he had passed away. Now, I had just been visiting him the previous weekend. He was not in good shape, but it never occurred to me he was going to die because I would obviously not left. But now I know from the research that's what's called a wraith. And most intelligent communication occurs at death or within 24 hours. And it's basically the deceased is trying to send some kind of message to a loved one. Either this is where the will is, or I love you, or I've been murdered, and that's called a wraith. And again, it's normally within 24 hours. Most hauntings, which tend to be perpetual, or at least go on for a period of time, I should say, that seems to be some aspect of the dead person and not the mind of the person. Oh, by the way, one point I should have mentioned earlier, because it's quite intriguing. The ancient Greeks thought that, for example, you and the person you're talking to now, me, that's not what's going to survive in the afterlife. The ancient Greeks actually thought that the psyche, that's actually your dream soul. You had several souls, according to the ancient Greeks, and the person you are when you're asleep is what survives. Popped in my mind because it's interesting, again, this notion, the linkage between death and dreams and sleep. But those are the closest paranormal experiences I've had. Now, I should mention that a considerable number of people, in fact, in the 1970s, there was a noted article published about people that had been married to one person for over 35 years. Mm-hmm. An incredibly large number of those people claim post-death contact. I forget the exact percentage. It may even be the majority. Although most of them never tell their families, for the simple reason they are afraid that the family will think they're having a mental illness or some kind of dementia coming on. And it ranges from very clear, for example, they'll describe the deceased person sitting on the bed with them, talking to them, to conversations over a period of time, to just glimpses, or even a scent. For example, perhaps the husband is dead, and he always wore a particular aftershave. Strangely enough, I had a student in class once tell me that she was, after class, of course, she was convinced, and her husband was a pipe smoker, and after he died, she knew he was in the room. She would smell the tobacco. He always used a certain type of tobacco. And by the way, I should have mentioned this story. This is by far the most interesting one I heard from students at the university here. There was a young girl at the time, this was many years ago, she was about 19 years old, and again came up after class, and she said that she had this really close girlfriend. They were almost like sisters. And the girl had died a horrible death in a car accident at age 16. And she then said that she continued to have contact with this girl. The girl would appear in her room, at special times, like a junior prom, graduation, she would just talk to the girl. Well, what was intriguing, she had a relatively small wedding. She got married at a young age, roughly 18. And she had a relatively small wedding with 50 guests. Later, when they were examining the pictures, wedding pictures, the girl was in them.
Wow.
And it's interesting because that's how ghosts normally appear. They're solid and three-dimensional. Nobody remembered seeing this girl at the reception. That doesn't mean that someone that resembled her wasn't there, but there was a relatively small reception. No one is ever talking to her when she's photographed. She's just standing there in various postures. And this is a very clear photograph. The girl actually brought her wedding album, and she clearly kept these in particular besides her wedding pictures. And she says that, and then she showed me a picture of the girl, the last one she had. Now, one of the notions in all cultures, like again the ancient Greeks, that you keep the appearance you have when you die. So she's still 16 years old in the picture in a dress. Oh, by the way, I should mention, in case people are very elderly listening to this, we have many traditions, especially in Siberia, in shaman cultures and so forth. And also the idea seems to be found among the Celts that when you get the other world's a reverse world, and when you get there, you age backward. So if you get there when you're 95, you eventually turn into a younger and younger person, then you turn into a baby. Well, you get younger and younger, then you become a baby again. So the time is reversed.
And then you don't exist and reincarnate?
Yes, then you're reborn again.
Oh, okay.
So you go to the other side to basically be reborn, to age backward. The witches under Gardner, Wiccan tradition in the 1950s, either he preserved that idea or brought it in. He has the same notion, though, calls it Summerland, where people die and they get refreshed and renewed and then eventually are reborn. I always thought that appeals more to us as we age. So you can become younger again. But again, this back to the student, it was quite striking. And what intrigued me looking back, or what intrigues me now, is often they'll have these programs on Sci-Fi Channel and so forth, and people photographing little balls of light, and they'll say this must be a ghost. In real hauntings, the really well-documented appearance of apparitions, they're three-dimensional, they appear solid, and you couldn't really tell if the person's a ghost or not, except in a lot of traditions they don't blink and they don't cast a shadow. That's found in many traditions.
Yes.
There was an Icelandic woman who allegedly had psychic powers in the 1970s, and she claimed that when she went to a large city like New York, she would see all kinds of dead people on the streets, and no one recognized them as such. They were just walking around. They appeared to be ordinary people.
Just living their lives.
Well, or just for some reason walking there. Now, by the way, we also find a widespread notion, this is again found in Judaism as well, that if you don't recognize that you're dead, you may stay here when you shouldn't be. That's why there's a lot of traditions where they tell the person they're dead to move on to the next level, because the person could get, in a sense, trapped here. That's found in some traditions. That's what ghosts are in some traditions. They don't realize they're dead, and they're still living in the house. And they may be annoyed by the presence of other people there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, another thing interesting about the dead, this is found in virtually all cultures, is, and this is why when people play with Ouija boards and try to talk, they'll ask, like, okay, what's going to happen in the future? A dead person wouldn't know what's going to happen tomorrow. In a lot of most traditions, I should say, in fact, I can't think of one where there's an exception, really. When you die, and if you become a ghost or a spirit, you're frozen in time. All your ideas, notions, opinions, prejudices you had the day you died, they're in your mind and they stay there. So if someone died in 1956 and you contact him with a Ouija board, he thinks it's still 1956. Reminds me, there was a famous case study by psychologists, neurosurgeons performed a really questionable surgical operation on this young, I think he was 16 years old at the time, or a young man, and he was having really dangerous convulsions, epileptic fits and convulsions, and they performed surgery on his head, his brain, and oddly enough, when he survived the surgery, but then he could form no new memories for any long-term time. I think there was a film about this, in fact. He would wake up in the morning. He still thought he was 16 years old or whatever it was when he had the surgery. He could do things that day and retain those memories, but when he went to sleep again, the next morning he woke up with no new memories. He still was 16. Now, that's exactly how a dead person would be. That's why if you want to know about the future in traditional lore, like in the Odyssey, when Odysseus tries to learn about the future, you must contact a dead prophet. That's why in all of these traditions, when they raise the dead, in fact, Odin does that in the Voluspa, which is in the Daic poem. He wakens this dead Sibyl-type prophetess to learn about the future. The notion here is when you're alive, you change every day, and when you're dead, you don't change at all. In fact, that's another notion why kind of last judgments are not really fair at some level, because people when they're 85 are not really the same people they were when they were 16 or 17 or 20.
True.
And frankly, we find all kinds of cases. There was recently one, I guess, in Connecticut, where a guy who had broken out of prison some 40-some years earlier had lived in Connecticut for many, many decades as a law-abiding, hardworking citizen, and they discovered he was some kind of armed robber who had stolen a car and some other things and threatened people as a young man.
Mm-hmm.
And he had gotten a 17-year prison sentence, I think. Of course, that was a trivial crime for what they gave him. But, sometimes the law can be really harsh on people.
And ladies and gentlemen, our guest this evening is Professor Mark Mirabello, and I have one last question for you, and that is, if time travel were real here and today, where would you go to?
Good question. If you'd asked me several years ago, I almost certainly would have said I probably would have gone to the crucifixion scene to see, of course, that would probably get me in trouble because I'd probably try to stage a rescue. But if you'd asked me that 10 years ago, but now I know more about history, we may have the date wrong. So I could see myself setting the time machine and getting it wrong. So I wouldn't want to take the chance. So nowadays, I would probably go back, again, if I went into the past, even though I'm not a specialist in ancient Egypt, I would love to see the Old Kingdom. That's the height of ancient. It's really curious civilization because everything they do is at the beginning, and then they spend the last 2,000 years trying to maintain it, and it slowly decays. Darwin's taught us that things kind of evolve. Well, the Egyptians are the reverse. Everything they do of significance is in the Old Kingdom at the start. So I'd probably go there, but I would know enough to go armed because they would, if you suddenly appeared in an ancient society, they would probably either think I'm a god and worship me or try to kill me.
Yep.
And I'm going to assume they're going to try to kill me. So I'm always plan for the worst case scenario. Now, as I get older, there's also the dream that I even though I'm a historian, I'd like to even see the future and to go and see what happens. Although, as I've aged, I've gotten more and more cynical that I think Western civilization may be in trouble, and it's very possible that if I were to visit the United States in 200 years, I won't even be here anymore. So at the rate we're going. So several choices. But the time machine is the ultimate fantasy for anyone who is a historian. So I couldn't really make one choice. I'd want to keep going.
And of course, if life is a holographic reality, time travel, just will it into existence. You can will yourself into the past or the future.
That's true. Very important. And by the way, this idea, in fact, I think one of the points I make at the end, very important in the book, if all reality is a thought, it's very important to have positive thoughts about the next side. There's a really interesting Hindu legend about this woman. She's a princess, and she's really in love with her husband, and he dies. And she really misses him, and she wonders what has happened to him. So she prays to a goddess, and all she wants to do is see what her husband is experiencing. And the goddess appears and puts this woman's mind into her husband's mind. This is on the other side of the grave. And when she gets there, and it's in his mind, he's actually thinks he's still alive, reigning with his queen by his side, his princess. And the goddess explains that basically the next life is based on expectations and desires. So if the, for example, listener believes that there is no other existence, this is the only life we have, he'll probably end up in some kind of dark place, and he'll think he's in a coma or a permanent nightmare. And if the person thinks that there's a Christian heaven with angels and Jesus will be there hugging them, that's what they'll see. And the Comanche Indian who died some years ago hunting the bison on the Great Plains, he really will find his happy hunting ground with bison and wild cherry juice. It's very important, and this is especially in the Eastern cultures, to think positively and think about existing on the next side. Because if you, sadly enough, if you think there's nothing, that's what you will experience. And by the way, there's a negative side to this for ultra-pious people, because often great sinners think they're not so bad after all, and then really pious people, maybe an elderly church lady thinks she's actually a bad person and deserves hell, even though all she does is help people out and bakes brownies for the children and so forth. They tend to be tough judges on themselves. The very, very good people are the toughest judges. And cut yourself some slack and think, well, you're relatively good, and you'll achieve a better life or existence on the other side.
Yes.
And view it as an adventure. There's a lot of traditions that we do continue to exist, and we'll find wonderful things. By the way, another concept I talk about at length is there's also, because you referred to time, I've always been intrigued by this, is block time notions, that there's no such thing as the passage of time. McTaggart, who was a Cambridge philosopher, discusses it in the early 20th century. It's found in Hinduism. They call it Brahma time. And essentially, all time exists simultaneously. They say that humans stand at the river and see the waters go by and think there's the passage of time. The gods see the entire river at once, and that's how time exists. So right now, for example, I was really close to my father, who died in 2007. Somewhere, he's 12 years old, playing baseball, which he liked to do, having fun. Somewhere, my great-great-grandmother is a 6-year-old child playing on the floor. Somewhere, you're 14 years old. Somewhere, I'm a much older man, hopefully. Somewhere, I'm a child. And according to block time notions, when you close your eyes in death, it actually immediately starts over for you. You're born again, basically conception. And now there was a Russian occultist named Uspensky who discusses this at length, and I talk about it in the book. He suggested that some people, now to me, I've had a wonderful life, so I wouldn't mind playing it all over again. I remember talking to this with my father when I was doing research. He liked the idea too. He had a wonderful life as well, and I think he looked forward to it if that were really the possibility. But Uspensky suggested that it'd be possible for a few people to actually escape this if they had strong wills. And what he suggested was, well, first of all, everybody who's existed will always exist. Like, we'll use a Southern idea, which I also use in the book. Jefferson Davis, there's always a Jefferson Davis. But you can hypothetically escape into the past and become where there's a vacancy. Now, what he said was that some people either themselves have become really strong-willed and could escape into another past life, or their souls decline and they kind of died in the next life. And then there's a vacancy, but the person still exists, and then you could go into and occupy that person. Uspensky said changing is only possible into the past, not the future. And he said the way you do it is you change yourself. You can't change the world, but if you become somehow a different person here and now, you will become somebody else in the future. But that was just Uspensky. Most people say that, again, this is called the eternal recurrence. Nietzsche, the German philosopher, was convinced it was real, that the entire universe just plays... I'm sorry, I'm confusing two ideas now. Sorry about that. That's a whole other idea. and which I should also talk about. That's the idea that all possible things occur, and that we essentially will die here, and then we may not exist for another trillion years, but the entire universe then alternately repeats itself. And these are two levels, I talk about this in one chapter, two types of existence without a soul or without a God. If time repeats in the eternal recurrence, or if there's block time, we still exist and are essentially immortals, although we're leading the same life over and over again. So, and incidentally, that's kind of a fair afterlife in some sense, unless you had a really horrible life. But you become, again, the same experiences, and you'll make the same choices because you're the same person.
Of course, you could go a different path.
Yes, and then according to Ouspensky, that's how you would end up being reborn as someone else in your next life.
Okay.
But see, even though if you pulled that off, there still would be a Bob Bain. So someone else is going to occupy your present Bob Bain. I shouldn't even use the word present; it implies time. The Bob Bain that is occurring as we speak.
Yeah.
Because he will always exist. And
I know there's one version of me out there gaining spider powers or doing some kind of weird crap like that. I'm just telling you. Anyway, Professor Mirabello, is there anything you would like to share with the audience before we head out, such as your website, any kind of appearances you might be making? Well, in fact, the website is again, my name is probably difficult to remember. It's markmirabello.com. The last name is spelled M-I-R-A, B as in boy, E-L-L-O. And I have a website, markmirabello.com. It has all the information, my books there and so forth. I will be appearing at an Afterlife conference, but that's a long way away, in June in Portland, Oregon. It's afterlifeconference.com. I'm one of the speakers there, but that's next summer. And certainly intervening activities will occur. But presently, I just urge the audience to think about the other side and prepare themselves for the other side. It's probably one of the most important things we can do in life is to prepare for death. It is truly the final frontier. Space is not the final frontier. It's what happens to us afterwards. Exactly. Well, Mark, I definitely appreciate it. It's been a truly intriguing conversation, an enlightening one. Well, thank you, and I've enjoyed being on your program. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was Professor Mark Mirabello. And again, his book is A Traveler's Guide to the Afterlife, Traditions and Beliefs on Death, Dying, and What Lies Beyond. And again, if you are interested in reading more about this book, you can go to mysteriousmasters.com/afterlife guide. Well, folks, until the next time we do come back together again, I bid you all a kind farewell.